All right, so we've got a little bit of sourdough left over, and we want to feed it so that it's happy for the next batch. I always feed my sourdough before I store it cold in the fridge as well. A sourdough that's been recently fed, put in the fridge to sort of chill out and rest will be perfectly fine to use for at least a month in my experience. And if it's been more than a month, you can pull it out, feed it, put it back to bed if you're not planning on using it, or use that sourdough to bake some bread. So we've got a little bit left over from making a batch of bread. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of this sourdough and I'm going to feed it. Obviously there's lots of different sort of mythology surrounding sourdough feeding and sourdough starters. My perspective on it is just keep it simple and keep it consistent so that things don't change. If you start, applying all of these different rules to the sourdough starter, then you might see things start to change. You might see the behavior change. It might get more sour, more active, less active. So my experience is, try to give it similar conditions each time you use it. I know it's hard with seasons. Your kitchen might be colder in the winter, warmer in the summer. But in the winter, try to find a warm place. In the summer, try to find a cool place. Try to keep that consistent and feed it consistently, and you should have less issues with the sourdough starter, kind of dying or drifting on you. So feeding, for me, there's lots of different approaches. This isn't the only way to do it. For me is I like to use a clean deli container. You probably, get some takeout that comes in these things. Get them clean, reuse them quite a bit. Very, very easy to handle. So for feeding the sourdough starter, I usually use a 1:2:2 ratio. What that means is that I'm going to take 1 part of existing bubbly sourdough to 2 parts flour, 2 parts water. So we're basically outnumbering that sourdough starter with lots of food, lots of flour and water. And what that's going to do is it's going to force those microbes into a bit of a growth phase. The lactobacillus, the yeast are going to have to multiply, and that's going to help keep them in check. It's going to help keep them active. What we often see if people, only feed a sourdough starter, like I was taking something like this and just putting in a tablespoon of flour and water, is over time the bacteria tend to dominate. They tend to make it very liquidy. You get this kind of sour soup, and at a certain point the bacteria are so active that the yeast just don't stand a fighting chance, and then they stop fermenting, and that's how you kind of get that sour pancake effect with sourdough bread. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make enough starter to make a loaf of bread tomorrow, and also save a little bit of starter to make more starter. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to take 50 milliliters of water. Awesome. I'm going to take 50 mils of flour, or 50 grams of flour. So I'm going to have 100 total in there. A little bit more. Good enough. And then I'm going to use a wet spoon, way easier for handling sourdough, and I'm going to take out 25 grams of this sourdough starter. So I'm going to eyeball it. We'll see how close I am. 22. Not bad. Okay. That's good enough for me. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same coffee stirrer for stirring up our starter. It's really important to get this stirred up really well, not only to make sure that the sourdough culture is dispersed really evenly, but also what we're doing is we're aerating it, we're oxygenating it. The yeast and the lactic acid bacteria, the other microbes in the sourdough starter, they're just like us. They like to be able to breathe. If they're given some oxygen, they're going to have a better time getting off to the races and growing. So it's important to make sure that this gets some really, really good mixing. And I think that helps a lot with results for sourdough starters. The worst thing you want to do is just sprinkle in a little flour and stir it in. Make sure this is mixed really well, and I think it usually pays off in terms of the results. Cool. So then we can try to scrape it down on the sides, but also it's nice to just alternate these containers. Try to make sure that they stay clean. I'm going to mark 11 as to where I think the starter starts. So I'm going to say it's around here. So we know we have a starting point, because what we're looking for in the growth of a starter is we want it to usually at least double, double or triple in size. That tells us that it's really active, it's really bubbly, and then we're not going to be waiting forever for our actual bread dough to ferment. This is a 100% hydration sourdough starter, so obviously some people do lower hydration, firmer starter, higher hydration, more liquidy. I find this is kind of a good, happy balance, but different starters can give you different results. And then in terms of letting this guy rise, just like with the bread, try to find a warm place if it's winter in a kitchen, try to find a cool place if it's the summer. And with these lids, again, it's very easy because we can snap the whole thing on, and then I can just go and pop up one corner of it. And that's going to give enough room for gas to escape, but it also is going to protect it from the elements and keep, one of the issues in the summer is fruit flies, keep things like that out. So I'm going to let that guy rise. It's probably going to take us about 8 hours. So, something like overnight or, mix it in the morning, come home after work. Usually it's ready to go. So here we are. It's about 8 hours later, and as you can see, our sourdough has risen past the doubling mark, right? We've gone, this is where we started, and it's taken us up to here, nice and bubbly, ready to be used to make any bread that calls for sourdough starter.